You're listening to Spellbound.
Welcome to episode 28 of Spellbound. I'm Julian Smith. Spellbound is now a CastBox original. You can still listen to it anywhere else you typically listen to podcasts, but check out CastBox today and see what's making it the fastest growing and highest rated podcast app for both iOS and Android. I'm joined today by Ian Bremmer, and I'm super excited because Ian is a really smart guy. He's got a book. I haven't finished it yet, but I'm a fan of where it's going, and I'm interested to hear your thoughts. But first, a quick setup for you, Ian, before we dive in. You are a political scientist specializing in U.S. foreign policy, states in transition, and global political risk. You're the president and founder of Eurasia Group, a political risk research and consulting firm with offices in New York City, Washington, London, Tokyo, Sao Paulo, San Francisco, and Singapore. Good Lord. And you're also the author of several books, including the New York Times bestseller Us versus Them, The Failure of Globalization. And you're a columnist and editor-at-large at Time, referred to as the Guru by The Economist and The Wall Street Journal. Your whole book, Us versus Them, is about how globalization is failing. You know, just give us like the quick bullet points on your argument and what you're trying to spread awareness about before we dive in.
Sure. Well, to be clear, globalization is not failing. Globalization is extraordinarily successful. I mean, we have taken the majority of people in the world out of extreme poverty over the course of 2 generations. 90% of 1-year-olds today get immunizations. The vast majority of the people living in the world today are educated, they're literate. That's extraordinary, right? So globalization clearly works. But globalism, which is a political ideology promoted by leaders in the West that says that if you support open borders and free trade and the U.S. and allies promoting global security, that'll be good for you. And that's failed because the average American and Canadian and European and Australian and you name it in the advanced industrial democracies really do not feel that system has worked for them, not economically. Many of them have either lost jobs or in dead-end jobs that they can't stand, and their wages have been flat for decades. They are not happy with the level of immigration of people coming in and how much that's changing societies around them. They clearly have gotten the short end of the stick in the United States and its allies fighting failed wars around the world, where it's only the enlisted men and women and their families are not the wealthy, they're not the privileged, right? You know, Trump was able to get out of that, but others could not. And they're not necessarily treated well when they come back, and Lord knows they're not heroes since we've been failing in all these big wars. And all of this is made much worse by trends in technology over the past few years, really helping to divide our countries much more. So here we are in 2018 in a tremendous global economy growing 4% a year, the United States at full employment, and we're doing great growth, and markets are up record levels on a daily basis, and yet our country is more divided than at any time in your or my lifetime. That is obviously going to get dramatically worse when we have a bump or a hiccup in the economy, and this book is about that.
So you just used 2 words there, globalization and globalism. Would you just kind of differentiate those a little bit?
Well, so globalization is just this economic process where goods and services and ideas move faster and faster all over the world. And that economic process of globalization, as I mentioned, has been incredibly successful. Makes me more optimistic about the world than pretty much anything that humanity has ever done. Where globalism, this political ideology manifested, from pro-free trade, from Western leaders, advanced industrial democracies, their governments, their media, their public intellectuals, their business leaders, their bankers, telling their own domestic constituents, if you support that, your lives are going to be better. That has not worked out. And that's why we have Brexit. That's why we have Trump as president and Bernie Sanders doing as well as he did. It's why we've gotten Doug Ford decisively beating the Liberal Party in Ontario a few weeks ago. It's why we have by far the most anti-established anti-establishment government in Italy since World War II, and on and on and on. So why Merkel's so weak in Germany. So this it's not people that are in the one of the things that people get wrong in the United States is everyone's talking about Trump and how horrible Trump is as if he's the problem. He's not the problem. The problem is how did you get to a country where far more people voted for nobody than voted for Hillary Clinton, right? I mean, I could care less was the winner in the most important election of our lifetimes in the United States.
If I can interject real quick, you just used the T word, so I want to just get your back there because I feel like anytime anybody says that word, it's just like people have a huge reaction. You're not trying to advocate for him or to say he shouldn't be in office. You're just stating facts.
I'm deeply sympathetic to why people that feel like they've been lied to for decades from all of the leaders would want to protest and would be willing to vote for someone completely unqualified to break the system. And that is not just talking about Trump. That's talking about Brexit. That's talking about Palestinian kids throwing rocks or throwing themselves against the Gaza border when the Israeli Defense Forces has, orders to use lethal force against them. I don't think those are different things. So for me, Trump is a symptom of something very much deeper. And while we can talk about him, he shouldn't really be the focus.
That's
the
what I
focus
think.
should be what happened.
I agree with you. Yeah, I think you're right. And I didn't mean to derail you there. You were in the middle of a brilliant observation. No. You said the T word, and that was a trigger, so I wanted to catch your back there. So just to be clear before we move on, globalization and globalism, these are kind of like counterintuitive ideas. They're totally in opposition, which is funny because they both have the word global in it.
Well, I mean, clearly globalists support globalization, right? But if one is an economic process that doesn't involve whether politicians do anything to redress it, I mean, globalization creates problems. You get all this growth. It's by far the best system out there. I mean, economically, there's nothing that's going to work better, and yet, some people are left behind.
That's part of the problem is it's worked so well, you could say.
Well, I mean, part of the problem is that the politicians don't care. Part of the problem is that you have people in the top 10%, 1%, 0.1%, 0.01% that have done magnificently well on the back of globalization, and they have more power than we've ever seen on this planet, and their willingness to use the dirty word here, redistribute, to invest in the people that didn't make it, that aren't as fortunate, has really not been adequate. And so you've entered a new gilded age, like we had before the Great Depression, like we had in the run up to World War I, when structural inequality is massive and people in power don't really care.
So this brings me to my next question. How does globalism fuel populist movements?
Well, it makes a lot of people in the West much angrier and willing to either check out completely or vote for anything that will oppose the existing globalists, right? And that's how you got Trump. So what's interesting is the one advanced industrial democracy where this is not true, where it's not happening. The only one where, where the media and the business elites and the bankers and the politicians are just as well respected today as they were 40 years ago. There's only one. It's Japan. And the reason that's interesting is because Japan is the only one of those countries that has actually kind of rejected globalism to begin with. So, for example, you don't have a lot of Japanese workers that are being left behind by globalization because there aren't any Japanese workers. The population is shrinking so fast that per capita they're actually doing better. You don't have a lot of Japanese angry about open borders because they don't have open borders. Migrants don't come to Japan. Japan is completely Japanese. you don't have a lot of Japanese angry that their kids are being sent off to fight in wars and die, that the poorest segment of society is being asked to give the most, um, because the Japanese are constitutionally prescribed from being able to send their armed forces to fight in wars outside Japan. So, I mean, and even the social media, which is such a problem in dividing country in the United States, for example, or in Europe, Japan has by far the smallest number of people in advanced industrial democracies on social media. Only 39% of Japanese actually have those accounts. So, I mean, it's kind of interesting when you ask how globalism fosters populism. You can also look at how an absence of globalism means ain't no populism.
So you're kind of saying that that Japan is an outlier because they're so insulated?
Yeah, because the Japanese never actually promoted any of the things that we have seen in the rest of the West. I mean, in the 80s and in the 90s, people didn't look to Japan as a model. They said the Japanese are sclerotic, they're not growing, I mean, the economy is kind of moribund. But today, what we say is the Japanese have incredible political stability at a time when all of these other liberal democracies are promoting these candidates that are saying they want to burn stuff down.
Mm-hmm. Japan's an interesting example because they're like 20 years ahead of everybody, technologically speaking. So it's strange that they're exempt from these economic and political problems.
I just think that some interesting, if you will, accidents of history and geography. They are also an island, right? So it's a little harder to get in there. But those things all matter.
Are followers of populist movements correct that globalism has let them down, or are there other factors at play?
They're not. I mean, not every single one of them is correct, but generally speaking, yes. I mean, all of these reasons that I mentioned, yes, sure, they've been affected by fake news, right? But the idea that the Russians are responsible for stealing our election is crazy to me. I mean, what the Russians did is they noticed that we have some incredibly deep divisions in the country, that a lot of people believe the system isn't working, and they rubbed salt directly in those wounds. And they were very good at using propaganda and using fake news and taking advantage of the advertising algorithms for social media and helping to take a whole bunch of angry, disenfranchised people and make them even more angry and more disenfranchised. But the problems were fundamentally there, and were fundamentally being driven by the fact that they believed that they were left behind as a consequence of the promotion of globalism from these elites, and they're angry.
Even if globalism shifts the playing field, aren't people better off in the long run because free trade raises the standards of living on average across the entire world?
Not all people. I mean, if you're someone in the United States that lost your job because it went to Mexico or China because of a cheaper employee and better supply chain, it's true that your goods at Walmart are cheaper than they would have been, but that doesn't help you very much if you lost your job. If the American government isn't investing in infrastructure and the education in your environment has gotten a lot worse and the policing is much worse and there's a fentanyl epidemic and you're dealing with painkillers and you're more depressed and you're suicidal, your life is worse. There are a lot of people in America whose lives are actually worse today than they were 40 years ago. And I don't see any reason why those people should be convinced that they should vote for free trade. I think that they see a more fundamental truth. They see that a lot of people are talking like you and me and saying, yeah, you should vote for free trade because it's better. It's like, well, wait a second. It's better for you. It's better for the system overall. But if the politicians are screwing me, why is it better for me exactly? Can you explain that to me? Is it trickle down? Because it's not trickling down. And so the answer is no, it's not better for you. And the rational thing to do is either not to vote at all because you realize that anything you do is just not going to make your life better, or is to support an outsider that's going to shake things up. And even if they're not that bright, at least maybe you'll deliver the message. Brexit was a much bigger deal than Trump in this regard. because the Brits voted for something that clearly is going to damage their country for a very long time. By the way, unlike Trump, it's permanent, right? But they still did it, and they did it, in my view, for reasons that make a lot of sense.
It seems like it's not as simple as whether or not free trade is a positive force, because it really comes down to people are greedy, right? Like at the end of the day, people who have more just want more, and they keep on wanting more, and they'll do whatever they have to do to shave a couple dollars off of their budget so they're happy to send the work to Mexico if it's cheaper, if it means they get to keep some more money.
Well, I don't think it's that simple. I mean, so for two reasons. I mean, first of all, because I think that you can be greedy and you can also be long-term. You can be strategic. And a lot of the things that we're doing right now in the United States that involve greed, potentially really don't work over the long term. Like climate change, one of the reasons why climate change has gotten so bad, because people are greedy short term. They're not thinking about the long-term implications of the behavior, which will affect like their kids who they really care about, things like that, right? So first of all, there's a consideration of what greed means. The Chinese are greedy, but the Chinese have a much longer term trajectory, and in part because their system is set up for that. They give up a lot to have that long term system, and I wouldn't prefer their system to mine. But we need to recognize that there's some real flaws. The second point is I know a lot of people that are a lot less greedy when you put them in different scenarios, right? I mean, we know that in smaller communities, people where you can actually see the person that you're affecting, you tend to give a lot more of yourself, not just money, but time and the rest. We know that people that are driving behind the wheel tend to think of pedestrians in ways that are more dehumanized. But then when you actually walk, you see those people and you treat them more nicely. And I think that, changes in the system, the political system, the structure, changes in technology, social media, these are things that can nudge people towards behavior that is more humane and civic oriented, or it can nudge people towards more short-term, all about me, narcissistic sort of behaviors. And right now, we have a political, economic, and technological system in the West that is all conspiring to orient people towards their more short-term and narcissistic and acquisitive impulses. And that is a bad thing.
You're saying that other countries have just different priorities. They're, like the Chinese, they're so different because their game is the long run, and whereas in America, our game is convenience and making your day-to-day life simpler.
I mean, I'll go even farther than that. I think the average Chinese and the average American are much closer to identical. People say Americans are capitalists, but I didn't grow up with any capitalists in the projects. None of us had any capital. I mean, my mother would have voted for Trump. My brother did. And just like almost everyone I grew up with, because all they wanted was a decent job, be paid well, and a better shot for their kids. And I think that's just like the average Chinese. When you start talking about elite behavior, the people that are in power, you need to start talking about what's the system they're interacting in. So do we have a capitalist system that's mostly private sector, shareholder driven, very short term, maximized returns, massive benefits from doing that, mostly controlled by men? Or is it a different type of system? And Canada's a little different, and Scandinavia is a little different, and Germany is a little different, and China is a little more different. And I think you need to look at those systems, those rules for interaction, and that determines what kind of strategies people will adapt and adopt to succeed.
You said something a second ago I want to go back to. You were saying that we shouldn't assume that globalization is creating a net positive worldwide, because there are people that it actually hurts. But I mean, if on average, doesn't the data reflect that globally things are getting better? I mean, it's an average, obviously, but if it's a net positive, isn't it a net positive?
The fact that globalization is an overwhelming net positive does not mean that people, the average person in the developed world today, is rational in voting to support it. Because the political system has allowed for a lot of people within their countries to be left behind. And the media and big business and public intellectuals and the rest have been complicit in that. So what I'm saying is, I actually think that voting, if you're in the UK, I think that a decision not to vote or a decision to vote for someone that's going to break something, depending on your situation, can absolutely be a rational decision. In other words, globalization works. It's a win. I support it. I also support globalism personally because, I mean, heck, I've done fantastically well. But that does not mean that it's worked for most people. It really hasn't. And I don't think we should pretend that those people should be supporting free trade.
So it's almost like we need a balance of both of these things, globalization and globalism. We need to know what things we can produce ourselves in our own countries and what things we need to rely on other countries for. Like what advantage do we each have that we should be focusing on? Because maybe America is better at doing certain things than other countries, and maybe Mexico, maybe they're better at certain things, and we should all just learn what those things are.
I think we know what those things are. Again, the economists have this right. Those that have been talking about, I mean, you look at Ricardo and the theory of competitive advantage in trade.
Right.
Free trade works. It absolutely works. The point is, something that works overall doesn't mean it works for you. And if your political system is such that you are being taken advantage of, that you are not being given opportunities, and it's going to get a lot worse with automation and AI and all the displacement of even more workers with even more skill sets. Unless we are really investing in those people for the long term and their families, then, frankly, this is how you get revolutions, right? Now, you're not going to get a revolution in the U.S. because people aren't starving to death. It's not like Tunisia. But in Tunisia, was it rational for those people to want to break their system? And the answer is yes. Because, you get to the point that no matter how much your IMF mandate is the right thing to do economically, if your money goes away and you're going to starve otherwise, I mean, if I were facing starvation, my mother would have killed people. Right. I have no doubt in my mind, right? And that would have been the rational thing for her to do.
Right. I guess that's the hardest thing about this conversation is it's survival, because survival is innately selfish because it requires you to, consume something that someone else can't have. You're claiming that for your own. So, we're trying to figure out how to survive as individuals and also, collaborate on a global scale, because it does work, like you said, but it's kind of this paradox.
I don't know that it's that much of a paradox in the sense that there are obviously systems that do it a lot better and systems that do it a lot worse. And
that do a lot better?
That make their social contract actually work for the average person.
Okay, and what can you give me an example?
Well, sure. I mean, I think you have to look at Canada and say they're doing a better job of this than the Americans are right now.
Right.
And in part because the role of money and special interests in Canada in determining political outcomes is just much less. Right. I mean, in the United States, you look at both sides of the political spectrum. You can look at trial lawyers. You can look at the American Association for Retired People. Look at big pharma. Look at big oil. Look at big finance. And they're able to capture the political system to help ensure that they get structural subsidies for their interests on the back of the average taxpayer. That does not serve the interest of the average American voter.
We recently had Darren Acemoglu, author of Why Nations Fail, on the podcast, and he was talking about the role of inclusive and extractive institutions in how that dictates whether or not a nation will succeed. How do you think that relates to the J-curve you developed to explain the link between openness and stability? Do you think there's any overlap?
Yeah, I mean, I first of all, I thought that I remember when the MIT economist, when his book came out, which was a few years back, I thought, here's an economist doing what I would have done as a political scientist if I were an economist. I mean, my J-curve book was really trying to understand it from the political perspective, that's how I was trained. which is looking at openness and stability, so political stability, right? But economic inclusiveness is another really interesting variable to look at in that regard. And I do think that one of the reasons the J curve is held up is because it's on the one hand a fairly simple concept, but it's one that a lot of people don't really take to heart. So the idea that if you are a stable country because you're closed, you want to stay closed. So, why did the Cubans benefited from 50 years of sanctions, not the Cuban people, but the Cuban government, because it allowed them greater political stability. And when Obama wanted to try to open it, they were freaked out, right? Because they understood that a few years of Kardashian would be a lot harder for their government to stand up to than 50 years of sanctions, right? And North Korea, same thing. One of the reasons I'm skeptical ultimately that we're going to be able to get a truly workable deal with the North Koreans is because I don't believe that the vision that Trump shows them of this incredibly rich, globalized North Korea is one that the North Koreans believe they could pull off without being thrown out of power. Mm-hmm. Given what they've had to do, the repression they've had to engage in with their own society over the course of the past decades, generations, where countries like the United States and Canada and Germany are stable because they're open. And when you're stable because you're open, you're very stable, and you can make a lot of mistakes for a long time before anyone is able to actually break that system, which allows structural inequality to really grow and fester without any real threat to the government itself. That's why the Israel-Palestine problem is so pernicious, is because Israel is fantastically stable and open, and it works really well. It works better than almost any advanced industrial democracy in the world in terms of, transparency and open judiciary and rule of law, as long as you're not Palestinian in the occupied territories. And they've completely walled these guys off, and there's just nothing they can do about it.
Right. Now, you said, we're talking about stability, and you said you think America is fairly stable. I mean, are you talking economically you think it's stable, or politically you think it's stable? Because I would say it doesn't feel that stable in a lot of ways.
Oh, my God, I think it's incredibly politically stable. I mean, when you have this much structural inequality, and as I mentioned, most Americans don't even bother to vote. And you have, you get people to demonstrate on the weekends, right? I mean, we just had some of that in response to the immigration issue, for example. We've had it with Me Too, and then they go back to work during the day. I mean, it's not Tunisia, it's not Egypt.
I see what you're saying.
Iran.
I see what you're saying.
Incredibly politically stable. Yeah, our institutions aren't going anywhere. You could say that there's a sclerosis which has stepped in, that they need to be structurally reformed, but they're not going to break. And I think even 4 or 8 years of Trump, despite the fact that he clearly is authoritarian in inclination and he'd be much better off if he could stop the investigations in their tracks, or if he could end a free media, but he can't. He just can't do it.
I guess when I say it feels unstable, I'm talking about the polarization that is just palpable in America right now. I mean, depending on, I live in California, so it's pretty. People in Southern California are pretty like-minded for the most part. But anytime I travel to the South, or I don't have to tell you anymore. You already know exactly what I'm saying. It's extremely polarized.
Yeah, but of course, it's not nearly as polarized as Israel-Palestine, which is also incredibly stable, right? I mean, there's no threat to Israel whatsoever. I mean, they can't breach the walls. The Israelis are even building walls under the ground, so they stop the tunnels. They've got an iron dome, so they can't launch missiles anymore against the Israelis. They've got incredible extreme vetting. I mean, I've taken flights, Lord knows, to Tel Aviv many times, and that's extreme vetting, vastly better than TSA and American airports. It's incredibly stable. You used to have people like Tom Friedman that were saying, oh, if Israel doesn't have a two-state solution with Palestine, then it's going to be all over for Israel. That was just wrong. Mm-hmm. It turns out walls really work. And look, I don't want a society like that. And yet we're creating one increasingly in the United States, but we can't pretend it's not stable.
Yeah, so I guess it's the media is really not helping the political climate. It's got to all be because of the media. The media is misrepresenting facts or something like that, right?
Well, certainly the media is part of the problem. I mean, the media is, of course, it's not the BBC. It's
Right.
not, sort of funded by the government
They're
and
capitalist
independent.
institutions.
Right. And they're making a lot more money than they were, especially given the pressures that were on them coming from Facebook and Amazon and the rest, making a lot more money by polarizing and giving people what they quote unquote like, which means they're treating them as product for advertising as opposed to treating them as citizens. And that's really facilitated by changes in technology that are, sort of so we can really narrowly algorithmically drive sort of our content for exactly the right segment of population that it will resonate with the most. And that means that you don't have a conversation. And I really do feel the problem here because, I mean, if you look at my Twitter account, my pinned tweet actually says, if you're not following people you don't like, you're doing it wrong. I'm happy to help. And I put that up right after the last election because I felt like it was important for me to put my cards on the table and say what these companies are trying to do to you to make money is in their interest and not yours.
Right. Yeah.
And you need to, it's just like cigarette companies. It's just like food companies in the 60s where they were feeding you salt and sweet and fat maximum amounts because they made more money that way. And you pretended that's what you wanted, but it led the United States to have type 2 diabetes more than anyone else in the world and obesity and all the rest. And we're now doing that not with our bodies, but our body politic. We're doing that with the way people think, the way we get information. We're being fed crap by these companies because they know that that's how we give them more money, and it's not okay.
I guess that's the downside of capitalism, right? Because people vote with their dollar and they buy things that makes them feel good. But we've got this dopamine epidemic where people are just saying yes to all this stuff that they really shouldn't have.
Well, the purpose of government is to be an impartial arbiter, to regulate effectively so that companies can't do that, to get rid of monopolies, to create fair competition, to serve the common good of the people. But when corporations become so powerful that they are able to capture the decision-making capabilities of the government, then obviously the people that get screwed in that equation are the ones that are now deciding why should we bother to vote or we should vote to break the system. The system is rigged against those people. It is actually true.
You can't keep someone from selling something that's bad for people. I mean, especially because most of the research, I mean, that the people who were addicted to cigarettes back in the day didn't realize it was bad for them until 20 years after they had, they were already well addicted by that point. Their doctors were telling them it was okay. So there's this huge conflict of interest. And these, if you have enough money, you can convince anybody to, you can convince anybody of anything pretty much.
And now we have, big warning labels and major taxation and all these lawsuits against these cigarette companies. So we eventually got there, but that doesn't really help if you died from, sort of lung cancer before any of that was in place. And that's, of course, that sickness is what's actually happening to a lot of Americans today.
So I'm just trying to paint a portrait of where we are in this conversation. We've got all these people that are buying stuff they don't really need. We've got people who are in leadership in this country and in other countries who've had things too good for maybe too long and probably shouldn't be in leadership. We've got a slew of problems we've addressed. What do you think the answer is to all this stuff? Is there an easy way out?
No, there's not an easy way out. It's going to get worse before it gets better. But there are two avenues of fantastic opportunity.
Well, before we go there, how do you think it's going to get worse? What do you think is going to happen? What's your prediction, and then how will it get better?
Well, because our central government's not going to fix it, right? I mean, we elected Trump, and Trump is promoting domestically all sorts of continued globalism. I mean, what's he doing? He's giving out, massive tax break to the corporations, regulatory rollback, giving the corporations more power. I mean, the people that voted for Trump, they're not going to benefit from this stuff. And the economy is doing well, so he could give them some tax breaks. Short term, that's great for them. But when the economy starts turning down, who do you think is going to get hurt? It's going to be the government spending will get cut. And as a consequence, you'll end up squeezing these guys. So it's going to get worse. That's pretty clear. And the divisions in society will grow because we don't know how to address all these technological problems that we have, both in terms of displacing workers, but also in terms of feeding us the information that is bad for us, right? So it's going to get worse. But the ways it'll get better, first...
Can I ask you a question about that before you go on where it'll get better, how it'll get better?
Yeah.
Economies always crash. That's the nature of economy. It rises and falls. And I'm guessing that's because we take out these loans per se of consumer confidence, where the politicians convince the masses that they're trustworthy for this new bill is trustworthy and that they should just go along with it and vote yes. And then and then it collapses after a while because people are misinformed. You think that's an accurate picture of why it rises and falls?
I'm not an economist, so I mean, you're better asking Damon that question than you are me.
Okay.
But I mean, markets and economics are cyclical in part because people buy and run up bubbles. Mm-hmm. Some of which is a governmental problem, some of which is kind of endemic and natural to markets. And I don't necessarily think you can avoid recessions. Because even economies that are very, very well run end up with cyclicality economically. But you can certainly help ensure that when you have a downturn, that the worst off are taken care of.
In theory, it seems like it should be possible to have stability, complete economic stability, if people had access to accurate information all of the time.
I think even if you have great information, there's still going to be uncertainty about what the collective is going to do. The reason that you have asset bubbles in part is because you believe that other people are going to see a piece of information that you think you are early to the market with, right? Mm-hmm. So, I mean, why did Bitcoin do incredibly well? Well, it's not just a pyramid scheme. It's that, you had a whole bunch of early users to the market saying, I'm willing to make a bet with my money that there's a lot more people out there that can be convinced. And at some point, some of those people are wrong.
Well, yeah, there was consumer confidence, but what I'm saying is that if people weren't so beguiled by the media, if that wasn't such a problem, if people weren't being tricked by these politicians and stuff like that, and they actually had good information they were being fed, maybe they could make better bets.
I'm sure they would make better bets, but I suspect you would still see cyclicality in the economy.
Okay, interesting. All right, and then you were going to say the two ways you think it'll get better after it crashes.
Yeah, so one way it will get better is that as it gets worse, you'll have a whole bunch of individuals outside government, outside central government, that will start being entrepreneurial and doing things that will help resolve these problems. So, I mean, in San Francisco now, they have a plan to get everybody free community college education. They weren't doing that 10 years ago. That's a response, right? Mm-hmm. In Baltimore, you've got, public-private partnership between Johns Hopkins University and all the major CEOs try to ensure that the gap between town and gown is reduced and that these people are better educated and brought in with good jobs. That's new. That's a response to what we see happening. My book is a response. I thought about writing this book in 2009 and I didn't, because I'm like, well, it's not that big a deal. I know it's going to get worse, but no one's really paying attention to it. I can write it. No one's going to care. That was probably the wrong decision for me to make in 2009. In 2018, I put it out, right? And I started a media company because I think what's happening with media today is, as you mentioned, just much, much worse and part of the problem. So that's me doing something, right? Now, there are a whole bunch of people like that. So in the same way that now, today, 40 years after climatologists have been screaming about climate change, solar power is cheaper than coal during the day, in part because a whole bunch of individuals got together and said, we're going to do something. So part of this is going to be experiments from well-minded people who get to work. That's one reason to be optimistic. But the second reason to be optimistic is what happens outside the United States. I mean, it's globalization. You got to understand that for all of the problems of modern humanity, we've needed to rely mostly on white men to fix it. And white men are a very small percentage of the global population. Like, that's a really tough burden on us. Like, we've had to get to the moon, right? We've had to deal with climate change. We've had to fight the Soviets. All of these men, we had to deal with the potential overpopulation problem and fixing, nutrition. We now have an environment over the last 20 years where we've taken literally over 1 billion people out of poverty, and we're educating them. And over the course of the next couple of generations, you're not going to have to rely just on white men for your solutions. You're going to have entrepreneurship and technology that comes from billions of people. And you're going to have vastly better ideas as a consequence. You'll have so many more Mozarts. You'll have so many more Steve Jobses. You'll have so many more Einsteins. And I think that's exciting, right? That just means that the productivity of humanity in responding to these problems is going to go up so much.
So both of those answers basically say that we can trust technology and that technology is going to get us out of this mess. But I mean, isn't that right? Isn't that more or less right?
No, I think that the former issue has more to do with human resilience. That when we're pressed hard, we work harder. And those things, I mean, obviously everything that humanity does, interacts with technology in different ways. But I'm saying that in the same way that right now the government isn't getting it done, you're going to have a whole bunch of people like me starting a media company. You could say that relies on technology, but in reality, it's me getting off my ass and doing something that is more productive with technology as opposed to me doing something that's less productive with technology in resolving this problem. Same thing with Johns Hopkins, same thing with San Francisco, right? And the second solution is one that actually talks about the ultimate benefit of globalization, which is that we used to have a small sliver of really rich people and a big sliver of really, really poor people, and in between it was fallow. Now you actually have a huge bulge of a global middle class that's getting wealthier all the time. And with that, with education, with the Me Too movement in the United States. I mean, heck, one of the reasons I feel reasonably confident that when you bring a lot more women into positions of leadership in the United States, you're probably going to have a little bit more decisions made by consensus, right? Yeah. And that's a good thing. But it's not just about that. It's like you want more people in the world. We got over 7 billion people in the world. And if a much larger percentage of them are able to unlock their talents and capabilities to helping to resolve the world's problems, then we're going to have a much better planet. I don't think that's technology, that's people.
Right. Yeah. I appreciate you clarifying that. I think you're right. I think that ultimately humans are dependent. We're forced to be reckoned with when we're put under pressure. The research does show that globalization has made life, it's a net positive for everybody, even though it has kind of created some chaos here and there. So, yeah. Ian, anything else you want to say in closing?
Look, I mean, I think it's the reason I am a fundamentally optimistic person. I'm existentially optimistic because we're even here. And I think the reason this book reads so worryingly right now is because we're heading through a really challenging time. And we've had them before, but a lot of people listening to this podcast will have never gone through a period like that. So they're uncertain, they're maybe a little scared, and maybe they don't want to deal with it. And, what I'm basically saying is we are going to deal with it. And you may not want to deal with it now, but it's coming with 5 years, 10 years, 20 years out. And the earlier we deal with it, the better it will be for all of us.
I think you're right. Ian, thanks so much for being here today. I want to encourage everybody to check out Ian's new book, Us Versus Them, and follow him on Twitter. Ian, what is your Twitter handle? I apologize, I don't know it offhand.
It's at Ian Bremmer. Just one word, INBREMMER.
There you go. I guess that does it for us today. Be sure to subscribe if you're not already on Apple Podcasts or CastBox. It's the most popular place for most of our listeners. Third most popular being YouTube. YouTube, which is, I think, most popular because it's the only place to leave comments. If you're a commenter, that's a great place to watch, and we have a new YouTube channel set up for you for your viewing pleasure, youtube.com/spellboundshow. If you're the email and type, you can shoot me one of those, hello@spellboundshow.com, although you should know that most people just use Twitter and Facebook. We're just providing options. You don't have to use them. I'm Julian Smith. This has been Spellbound. I hope you're enjoying these episodes as much as I am. I'm just so excited about what's coming out next week because I have no idea what's coming out next week. We have so many good episodes lined up, and some of them are in the can, some of them are yet to be in the can, but they're all good, and so I'm not even going to tell you what's coming out next week. If you want to know that, you're going to have to check back next Monday. Until then, take care.